Welcome back to Beyond the Scoreboard. Over the past two episodes, we have explored how to design an offensive identity and how to build a defensive identity. But today, I would like to discuss something that connects everything we have talked about so far: practice. Every coach runs practices, every coach has drills, and every coach has a schedule. Yet, not every coach develops players, builds teams, or consistently prepares their team to perform when it matters most. Why? Because many coaches spend their careers searching for the perfect practice plan when they should be developing a practice philosophy. I often hear coaches ask questions like: drills do you run? How long are your practices? How many shooting drills do you do? Those are reasonable questions, but I don't think they are the most important ones. The better question is this: what is the purpose of today's practice? If you can't answer that question, it becomes almost impossible to know what belongs in practice and what doesn't. One of the biggest mistakes coaches make is treating every practice the same throughout the year. First practice of September shouldn't look like the last practice before a national championship. If your practices remain identical for 8 months, your team probably isn't evolving. Great coaches understand that practices evolve because the needs of the team evolve. I believe every basketball season is built around three coaching priorities: individual development, team development, and team preparation. All three exist throughout the year. The difference is which one deserves the greatest attention at a particular stage of the season. Let's begin with individual development. Imagine it's the beginning of your off season. You have 8 or 10 weeks before your first exhibition game. One player struggles finishing with their left hand. Another cannot consistently make decisions against defensive pressure. Let's say your post player lacks footwork around the basket, or your the best shooter struggles creating space off the dribble. Well, should today's practice focus on preparing for your first opponent? Absolutely not, because your opponent isn't your biggest challenge yet. Your biggest challenge is helping your players become better basketball players. And this is where I believe many coaches rush the process. They install offenses before players can pass. They install defensive systems before players can consistently guard the basketball. They practice special situations before players understand the fundamentals that create those situations. Basketball doesn't work that way. Every successful team is built upon successful individuals. During the off-season, your objective isn't simply to improve the team. Our objective is to improve every player sitting in the locker room. And this is why off-season practices are generally longer. Sometimes 2 hours long. Not because longer practices automatically produce better players, but because development requires time. Players need opportunities to learn, to experiment, to fail, to receive feedback, then to repeat and to improve. That's difficult to accomplish in like 1 hour or 75 minutes only. Our practices often begin with activation and movement preparation. Before athletes become better basketball players, they need to prepare their bodies to train effectively. From there, we move into dynamic warm ups before transitioning into individual skill development. This is where players improve ball handling, shooting mechanics, finishing, passing, footwork, defensive movement, and position specific skills. These sessions are rarely exciting. They don't always look impressive. There aren't many highlight plays. But this is where championships quietly begin. Because games expose weaknesses. Practice should eliminate them. As individual work progresses, we begin connecting players together. Now basketball becomes less about individual execution and more about decision making. And this is one reason I believe so strongly in 3-on-3s and 4-on-4s basketball during the off season. Many coaches rush directly into 5-on-5 situations. I prefer earning the right to play 5-on-5. Like small-sided games increase touches, right? So they increase decisions. They create more offensive and defensive reads. Players communicate more frequently. They defend in space more often. They attack closeouts more often. Well, simply put, more learning takes place because more players are directly involved in every possession. Now, eventually, as we approach this season, 5-on-5 naturally becomes a larger part of the practice. But only after players have begun developing the habits necessary to succeed within our system. One of my coaching beliefs is this: never ask your system to solve problems that player development should have solved. No offensive system can consistently overcome poor passing. No defensive philosophy can completely hide poor footwork. No late game strategy can replace poor decision making. Systems don't create players. Players make systems work. Organizations like Canada Basketball have emphasized the same principles through their long-term athlete development model. Individual player development shouldn't disappear because you are coaching a team. In fact, the better your players become individually, the more possibilities you create collectively. As coaches, we sometimes become so focused on winning our next game that we forget our greatest responsibility. Don't forget, we are teachers, and teaching requires development before preparation. I want you to think about this for a moment. The purpose of the off season is not to build your offense. It is not to build your defense either. It is to build better basketball players. Because every great team you have ever admired was first built one player at a time. So far, we have discussed the first coaching priority of every successful program, which is individual development. The off season is where players build the technical, tactical, physical, and mental foundation that allows your system to succeed later in the year. Eventually, the season changes. The question is no longer how do I make this player better? Now the question becomes how do I make this group better together? And this is the second coaching priority: team development. I believe this is one of the most misunderstood stages of coaching. Many coaches assume that if they have talented players, they'll naturally become a great team. Well, history tells us otherwise. We have all seen talented teams underperform because they never truly learned to play together. Basketball isn't simply five skilled players sharing the floor. It's five players making connected decisions. Team development is where your offensive identity begins to take shape. It is where your defensive principles become habits. And it is where players learn spacing, timing, communication, trust, and accountability. And this is why, as preseason approaches, the structure of practice begins to change. Individual development remains important, though, don't get me wrong, but it no longer dominates every session. Instead, we spend more time connecting players through small-sided games, offensive concepts, defensive rotations, transition situations, and controlled 5-on-5 basketball. I still believe strongly in using 3-on-3 and 4-on-4 because those formats force players to make more decisions and remain actively involved in every possession. But as the season gets closer, 5-on-5 naturally becomes a larger percentage of practice. Not because 5-on-5 is always the best teacher, because eventually the game itself becomes our greatest classroom. Now, let's move into the third coaching priority: team preparation. And this is where many coaches unintentionally make one of the biggest mistakes of the season. They continue practicing as though they are still in October. Now, it's January. Conference play has begun. Players have accumulated thousands of practice repetitions. Their bodies are carrying the physical demands of competition. Their minds are processing scouting reports, travel schedules, academics, and recovery. And at this point, our responsibility changes. We are no longer trying to build a completely new basketball player. We are preparing our team to perform at its highest level on game day. And that changes everything. Our practices becomes shorter. Typically somewhere between 75 to 90 minutes. Not because we care less, because we understand more. And quality becomes more important than quantity. Fresh legs are more valuable than another 20 minutes of repetitive drills. And this is also the point in the season where I move much of our individual development outside team practice. If one of my guards needs extra work finishing with the weekend, or one of my post players needs additional footwork, I don't necessarily stop 15 other players to address one individual's needs. Instead, I'll schedule in an individual workout before practice or after practice or another day. The same applies to individual shooting. Many elite players complete hundreds of game speed shots outside team practice. That allows our team practice to remain focused on team basketball. Sometimes we will even incorporate team shooting into our warm up session. Not because warm up shooting alone develops great shooters, but because it prepares players while allowing us to transition quickly into tactical portions of the practice. Time becomes one of a coach's most valuable resources during the season. Every minute matters. As the playoffs approach, the philosophy changes again. Many young coaches believe the biggest games require the hardest practices. I have learned the opposite is often true. Championship teams don't necessarily need longer practices. They need smarter practices. During playoffs and national championships, our team practices may only last 45 minutes to 60 minutes. By this stage, we are not installing any offenses, we are just refining it. We are not teaching our defensive philosophy, we are reshaping it. Practice becomes highly intentional. Every drill has a purpose, every possession has context, every correction has meaning. We spend more time on squat preparation, special situations, baseline and slide out bound plays, late game executions, and press offense and press defense and end of game decision making, situations that may decide a championship. And recovery also becomes part of coaching too. Sometimes the best decision a coach can make is ending practice 10 minutes early because the fatigue affects decision making, it affects shooting, it affects communication, it affects confidence. Managing energy is just as important as managing strategy. This is also where video becomes one of our most powerful teaching tools. I don't see film as separate from practice. I see film as another practice. Sometimes players learn more in 20-minute film session than they do from 20 additional minutes on the court. Film allows us to slow the game down. We can study spacing, recognize defensive rotations, understand offensive tendencies, identify habits, correct mistakes before they become repeated mistakes. As the season progresses, the classroom becomes just as important as the gym. Another philosophy I have developed over the years is this. Not every correction belongs in front of the team. If one player needs help reading ball screens, I will often address that individually. If another player needs to improve defensive positioning, we will spend time together outside team practice. Those one-on-one conversations create better learning while allowing the team to continue moving forward. Great coaches understand that team practice belongs to the team. Individual development belongs to the individual. Knowing the difference makes every practice more efficient. As we finish today's episode, I would like to leave you with one final thought. Many coaches ask, how long should practice be? I like to believe that that's a wrong question to ask too. A better question is this. What does my team need most today? Some days the answer is individual development, some days team development, Some days it's preparing for Friday night's opponent. The best coaches don't run the same practice every week. They adapt, they observe, they prioritize. They understand that practice isn't simply about filling 90 minutes with drills. It's about intentionally preparing players for the next stage of their development. Because basketball seasons are built in phases. First, we build better players. Then, we build better teams. Finally, we prepare those teams to compete at the highest level. When coaches understand the difference between those three priorities, practice stops becoming a routine, becomes a process. And that's where championship programs are built. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Beyond the Scoreboard. I am Mehmet Fatih Akser, and I look forward to seeing you in our next episode, where we will explore one of the most challenging responsibilities of every coach: teaching basketball IQ, developing players who can think, read, and make great decisions under pressure. Until next time, keep learning, keep teaching, and keep building players before building systems.